My name's Sam Biondo. I'm the Executive Officer at the Victorian Alcohol and Drug Association. We're part of the Tri-Peak arrangement with partnership with the Centre for Excellence and the Victorian Healthcare Association. And as you know, we've been running a number of sessions over the past year and a bit. This particular session, it's a great pleasure to have someone of the background and insight of Professor Sarah Kelly, or Associate Professor Sarah Kelly. So, and we're very, very grateful for her being able to participate today. I'm only making a cameo appearance at the beginning. I'm going to hand it over to Danielle Walt. James couldn't be here today, and Daniel, over to you.
Thanks so much for that, Sam. Well, look, welcome everyone. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands of which we're all gathered here today. I'm on Boonwurrung country here in Melbourne Southeast, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as any Aboriginal colleagues that we have here with us today. Welcome, particularly as it is Aboriginal Children's Day. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So today's webinar, as Sam mentioned, is part of the Tri-Peaks project, which is a collaboration between the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare, the Victorian Healthcare Association, and the Victorian Alcohol and Drug Association to support integrated practice and good governance across our three sectors. Today's webinar is being recorded. This is a Zoom webinar, so please use the chat and Q&A functions for any of your questions and comments. I'll be keeping an eye on them, and we will have time to have a chat with Sarah afterwards. And I just know that this particular topic is going to generate a huge amount of interest, so feel free to pop them in and we'll try to make sure to get to yours. The recording and presentation slides will be shared with you after the webinar, and they'll also be available on the Tri-Peaks websites on BARDA. Today's webinar, and it's a really exciting one today, is on gaming and esports, and it's going to be providing an overview of gaming and the esports landscape. It's going to look at some of the evidence on risks and harms, including things like health, gambling, associated with gaming and esports, and then it's going to look at the potential benefits, so how gaming technologies can or are actually being used in a really positive way. And today, to take us through this presentation is Associate Professor Sarah Kelly from the University of Queensland's Business School. So Sarah Kelly is the Associate Professor in Law and Marketing. She's globally known for her research, speaking and consulting in the sports field, and is also co-leading a research hub at the University of Queensland in trust, ethics and governance. She teaches sports law, which is just the coolest title for a law subject ever, having done law myself, I have to say, and marketing. She's won awards for her teaching and provides strategic mentorship to sports technology startup companies. She's a visiting fellow at Loughborough University's Institute of Sport, London, and OP Jindal University in Delhi. And her current research projects are focused on esports, women's sports, sports integrity, and mega event legacy. Serving on a range of corporate governance and not-for-profit boards across a variety of sectors since 2013, Sarah is a highly respected and accomplished business leader and company director with strong government and stakeholder relations capacity. We are just delighted to have Sarah here with us today, and really excited to get started on this presentation. So please remember, use the chat and Q&A function as we're going through, and Sarah, I'll hand over to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thanks very much, Danny and Sam, and all of you for attending today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'd really love it to be quite interactive there for the Q&A at the end. And as Danny mentioned, yeah, it is a very topical issue, this one, and particularly as a lot of us are currently, I imagine, watching the Olympics and the Paralympics coming up. You know, the very question as to whether esports and online video gaming will in fact become official sports. We can talk about a little bit today towards the end of my presentation around governance, because it becomes very relevant there. So look, thanks for having me. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm presenting from Brisbane in Queensland in lockdown, the Yuggera tribe, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and the future, who really know how to gather and connect and discuss critical issues so well. I mean, we can learn a lot from our Indigenous leaders, and how wonderful it is to watch so many perform so well in the current Olympic Games with the largest Indigenous representation on our national team, something to be proud of. So now I'm going to actually share a screen. Hopefully this all works. I think everyone can see that now.
Yes, we can. It's looking great. Thanks, Sarah.
Give us a shout out if you can. So look, I was just going to present first up on, as already been mentioned, I'll cover a few of our recent studies that were funded, and I would give credit to Vic Health and the Foundation of Alcohol Research and Education in particular for a couple of funded projects we actually undertook, examining some of the health and wellbeing impacts of competitive online gaming or eSports among young players and streamers. But also one I actually presented down at Parliament House at a forum in 2019, I think it is now, losing track of time with this COVID situation, around the advertising in eSports, using it as a platform in some circumstances really to kind of circumvent existing advertising codes and regulations around harmful product categories. And also just as a means in this highly commercialized online video gaming or eSports environments to actually target next generation consumers. So a couple of studies there, and then a recently published couple of others on a systematic review and governance in eSports. So there's a bit to cover today, but all of these are recent publications. So I've given you the references at the end of the presentation. And I will be circulating through TriPix, a PDF of the presentation as well. So I've just put up a photo there. Many of you hopefully will be aware of eSports, which is sort of the highly competitive, commercialized, hyper-connected global version of online video gaming that we see in arenaed events like the one you can see pictured, but also in our lounge rooms with many of our kids. I think you'll see playing competitive online video gaming with their friends and global connections even online, in their bedrooms in front of a variety of devices as well, whether it's the mobile phone, the PC or consoles as well. And I think there's two ways basically that people participate in these online games. The first being through actually playing the games, and the other being through just viewing or spectating, otherwise known as streaming. So a lot of the players, and particularly the more famous ones, who are significant social media influencers and influencers on the main platform through which these games are streamed, being Twitch, they have significant influence. And so often young people will just sit and view like we would view sports on free-to-air TV. So it's a very popular part of youth culture, and particularly with millennials and Gen Zs. So I've just put up some stats there to show, just how popular this is. Sorry, I'll just diminish there. It's extraordinary growth we are seeing in eSports and competitive online gaming, as many of you might be aware. It's growing on some reports 20% year on year. This is a more conservative recent estimate, but both the eSports and the more occasional viewing is growing. And an interesting facet to the viewing that differs from perhaps traditional sports or cinema and other and television streaming is that it's often consumed for extensive duration, long periods of time, and highly engaged as well. So very attractive to marketers and advertisers, keen to capture audiences for as long as possible. And this is a reason we've seen such a migration of sponsors, and particularly, significant sponsors of some traditional sports such as the Summer Olympics, migrating across to eSports. So we've seen big brands over the last 5 years migrate across to large eSports competitions such as the Intel World Masters Games. We're talking brands such as McDonald's, Mercedes-Benz, Louis Vuitton, Lots of Red Bull is a huge supporter. Coca-Cola being another one. And then over here to the right is a really interesting sort of map from 2019, with COVID being a little bit, difficult to access those stats yet. But I imagine through COVID, the participation in terms of streaming and playing of esports has spiked. And you can see, the breakdown of regions, and you'll see that our region is particularly engaged. We're seeing in Korea, Singapore, China, in particular Taiwan as well, Japan, very, very popular. And in Australia, probably not as strong as the growth in the Asian countries, but certainly growing at these exponential rates. So bottom line is, I think these competitive online gaming is here to stay, and something that, as people concerned with health and well-being among youth and families, need to really turn our attention to, as probably the most popular aspect of culture that we are seeing currently among, as I said, millennials and Gen Z, and probably the alphas coming through and into the future. So I just thought, for some of you who, I'm conscious some may not have a lot of exposure to this whole realm of competitive online video gaming, esports. So I just thought I'd give, there's a good sort of summary diagram there that sort of brings that together, the main stakeholders across the esports ecosystem, being the sponsors and brands. So that's the very commercialized side, the players. And as I said, it can be a 13-year-old or an 8-year-old in their bedroom at home, right through to professional players, some of which are earning, $500,000 US a year. Prize money for some of these competitions extends out to 13 to 20 million. So, and that's just the prize money, not the commercial endorsement as well. We've also got a lot of significant investors, and something that is of relevance to health and well-being, of course, is the trend in seeing traditional sports brands investing in esports. So the Golden State Warriors are one example, the NBA players. We're seeing here in Australia, some of our AFL teams, the A-League as well, are heavily investing in esports, whether it be through teams or tournaments running their own competitions, whether they're investing or franchising their brands as avatars and jerseys perhaps in the games as well. Formula One famously launched their e-racing during COVID last year to great success. Commercially and in terms of audience size. So it's certainly a trend we're seeing. The main reason being, of course, is the size of the audience and the engagement of that audience, and the ability to reach the traditionally and increasingly very difficult to reach young audiences in particular. So with these audiences, we're talking about the majority being minors. So there's one angle around policy that may be needed there as protectionist sort of strategy, and also mostly males at the moment, but we're seeing huge growth in the female market in esports as well. And then, of course, I've already mentioned Twitch as the main viewing platform through which esports and competitive online gaming is streamed. YouTube is very popular as well as the two main platforms. So quite different models for broadcasting and advertising, which I can talk about. I thought too, before I go into some of the results we certainly found in our empirical work, just highlighting some of the quite unique social issues associated with esports, being things that you've probably heard and read about, health risks and addiction. Yes, there are some negatives, which I think more broadly we see related, as Sam mentioned earlier in an earlier conversation, around screen use in general. So I think we need to overlay that piece as well. We can't just blame the esports, but some aspects to the structure of esports has been demonstrated to be highly addictive. And in fact, some of the structure and content in esports has been, microtransactions, for instance, exist in game. So there's some queuing to gambling-like qualities in some of the games and some of the genres as well. But some of them have actually been designed by gambling designers from gambling companies coming across to the esports owners and publishers. So that's an interesting side. But certainly that's an area of concern that some of these structures are addictive. There's also, conversely, tremendous power in this platform. And we're seeing those sort of numbers that I've just presented in audience size and growth and engagement. It could be, as has been traditional sports, for example, and other influencers, very powerful platforms for positive social change and behavioural change even. And in fact, we are seeing great examples of esports publishers stepping up to that kind of challenge and becoming very socially responsible in engaging kids in education and active sports, traditional sports as well, through their platforms. So, and even into technology and IT and creative design, employability, this is translating into as well. So there's a really exciting side to esports that we need to keep in mind as well. It's not all doom and gloom. We're also seeing, with the increased commercialization of esports, as I've mentioned, the migration of sponsors and numbers, the digital nature and cross-jurisdictional nature of esports means that there's incentivization for organised crime. It's easy to infiltrate through hacking, for instance, and a growing trend around what we call e-doping, which is essentially cheating through the digital nature of these platforms. Through planting particular advantages in game related to significant stakes financially in terms of that prize money and potential for endorsement, for instance. But what is concerning is we're seeing some of these young players being approached around match fixing, because this is a significant gambling market, both legal and illegal, attached to esports globally, Unicorn being one of the key brands there, taking esports betting. So yeah, there's obviously those incentives in terms of supply for organised crime and for match fixing. There's also what we're seeing, the rise of the esports influencer I've mentioned, where we've had very successful professional players, for instance, come on Twitch and actually stream as they're playing. So given, you know, the advent of ad blockers and things, and young audiences really able to control the advertising they see to a large extent, particularly through platforms such as Twitch, these influencers have a lot of power. So they're being endorsed and paid for their content, particularly brand-related content, some of which may be around harmful products, particularly directed towards minor audiences, such as alcohol, energy drinks, gambling products, junk food. But others, as I said, could also be a positive influence. So there's lots of examples of both. But in terms of policy and health issues, advertising, it's less about the above the line advertising and more about these influencers and their rising power in terms of resonating with young people. Diversity and inclusion is another social issue we're seeing in esports, where there's a lot of online bullying enabled through the digital nature of it. There's 2/3 male to 1/3 female. That's creating some issues as well. And overlaying that, a lack of policy and regulation that's universal among these global platforms. There's also a lack of literacy, a lack of education. So this is something that I'm a very strong advocate around, because what we've seen among parents we've certainly interviewed in our studies, teachers we've interviewed in our studies, and even policymakers are largely unaware of these, how these platforms actually function, the structure of the games, the content in the games. So, you know, that in itself is a problem. So I think we all need to have some literacy in this domain as well. And finally, one of the studies I'm going to walk you through is the rise in harmful product advertising as well, and influencer advertising, as I've mentioned. So this first this first study I wanted to present is just a content analysis we undertook of some popular esports games and tournaments globally. And what we found was placement in terms of advertising and harmful brands. The 4 categories we actually looked at were gambling, energy drinks, alcohol, and junk food. And you'll see the breakdown of the percentages we found, the proportions we found advertising in esports there. So quite interesting, where you see around 60% of the ones we looked at advertised junk food brands, 15% alcohol brands. And, you know, this is a bit concerning when you know that the majority of these audiences are very young and many minors as well, and totally unregulated. And then just going back here, this is the sort of plethora of platforms through which you can actually advertise and have some brand awareness happening, whether it's in paid content or endorsements or, you know, on the video gaming equipment, the naming rights, branded content pieces we're seeing increasing through the likes of Twitch and YouTube as well. So many different assets through which sponsorship and advertising brand exposure can occur. So in terms of the conclusions from that content analysis, which is now published, we found that an associated survey, which I'll go through in a minute, was that we found that gaming influencers were particularly powerful, as I've mentioned, that we do see that there's a lot of sponsorship by harmful product categories I've mentioned throughout esports across all platforms, but particularly through branded content, endorsement of the gaming equipment and the players. And there's also both adverse and beneficial wellbeing impacts of gaming, and I'll talk about that. That came out of the survey as well. But potential for it to be a positive form of social change, particularly through self-regulatory cohesion that is happening in some areas of the industry, but not in others. These are just some photos of some of the content analyses we undertook. Some examples of how the alcohol category, for instance, is permeating esports. Some of the publishers in their defense and which also own the tournaments, when I say publishers, I mean the game owners, and it's quite I suppose, a consolidated oligopolistic sort of industry where we have the big players being Riot, for instance, you may have heard of, where they have some codes of practice and policies around this, but unfortunately only those participating in their particular tournament are signatories and able to be within the ambit of those codes and comply with them or be sanctioned through a banning. But of course they can move around the system and move to another jurisdiction or tournament where in fact there's no relevant codes. So we do see alcohol, we do see gambling, we do see junk food and energy drinks infiltrating this entire ecosystem and space of esports. So just the survey that was flowing on from the content analysis we did, just to give you a quick snapshot, we basically found a high percentage of the population. It was almost 1,000 participants, young Australians aged 16 to 34 years, which typically represents the esports and competitive online gaming audience and participants. We found that many were very heavy gamers, and applying a well-cited scale and definition of addiction, we found that a large percentage were also actually potentially addicted to gaming, which was very concerning. So I've just thrown up the results there around that aspect of the survey. So even if you assume that there in the literature, there are a variety of scales that's used to measure addiction, as many of you would be aware. If we even took a range there of what can be defined as addiction, you could classify them at the very least as heavy gamers. And that in itself is concerning when you see the results of some of the further studies we've done, and in this study as well, which really showed that among heavy gamers in particular, they were most influenced by some of this advertising by harmful products, to the extent they weren't just aware of these brands, but they formed preferences and liking for these brands, and were demonstrated to consume more of those brands as well while gaming, affiliated with gaming, which really demonstrates that the placement of these brands through whichever platforms are concerned in the gaming sphere does have influence not only on effect, but also on their behaviour. And this one just summarises really the key findings around where the brands were most likely to be placed. So product placement, branded content, as I've mentioned, the gaming equipment, which is highly visible in all of these, the broadcasting as well was interesting to see. So we did find that alcohol advertising in esports is actually linked to consumption, particularly among the heavier gamers. So huge influence by the professional gamers, celebrity-like endorsements and payments going on. Heavier gamers tend to also discuss the brands that they see among these harmful product categories with their friends while they're gaming under the survey. And, you know, I'll talk about governance towards the end, but if we classify esports as a sport, that could help to an extent in governance and regulation, but it's a whole lot more complex than that. And we did see, and this should be emphasized, clear differences between heavy and more recreational or casual gamers, whereby casual gamers didn't so much form these preferences, weren't so affected in their behaviours. So it really combined with a second study, this one that I wanted to present, really say that the key message, I think, out of our research so far and a lot of the research is moderation is actually okay in the gaming space. And in fact, through this second survey study we undertook of largely teenagers, minors in other words, and their parents as well, what we found was that heavier gamers were associated with a whole bunch of quite negative well-being and even psychological issues in terms of connection, schoolwork engagement, part-time work engagement, social activity, physical activity. Whereas casual, more recreational gamers were actually, there weren't many adverse side effects at all. And in fact, they were no worse off than the non-gaming cohort we surveyed as well. So that was a really interesting finding, that in fact, by not gaming, you're no better off. So I think taking a really hard line and with parents or teachers trying to ban gaming altogether will not work. And nor is it demonstrated from our data, at least, to be beneficial in any way. So I think that's a really important finding. In terms of mitigation strategies, and that was one of the reasons we interviewed the parents, not only to cross-reference what we were finding among the self-reported sample among minors and the teenagers, but also to understand, well, what sort of strategies do you find work or don't work in your household in terms of your children's game playing or streaming time. And we did find that if parents who tried to mitigate through limiting the time spent gaming, we found had a better well-being outcomes and social outcomes among their children. So that was really good. So that is a really effective strategy. Another effective strategy was ensuring that the kids balance that screen time with physical activity. So really actively role modeling and encouraging them to get out and about, as well as enjoy their game time as well. There were reports, in interviewing some health practitioners, for instance, that there's been, this is concerning, particularly with the heavier gamers, spikes or associations with domestic violence associated with parents trying to physically intervene in the game time by removing consoles or cutting off the Wi-Fi in the house without notice. So that appears to be quite a big problem. So I think there needs to be mitigation strategies around that, where parents and kids sit down and really reach a kind of agreement or a contract, a norm around what is acceptable, what isn't, when in the gaming structure, you know, that it can be cut and it's time to stop and go and do your exercise or your study. I think that becomes quite important, that parents become educated around the type of game their kids are typically playing, and when in that gaming structure, it's fair to stop so it doesn't ruin the game and ruin their rankings on the ladder and all these aspirations a lot of these kids are playing for. So I think that works two ways as well. So this next study was, so we did a couple of surveys there on different studies. I've talked you through a content analysis that demonstrated quite a prevalence of harmful products advertising. And now we've just published quite an in-depth literature review focused on lifestyle outcomes associated with engagement in esports and competitive online gaming. And what we found basically was that online video gaming was associated with poor lifestyle outcomes in general. But again, most of these studies have not looked at, you know, breaking it down too much into the heavier versus very recreational gaming, for instance. Many haven't been done more recently, where they're really looking into this new highly commercialized, online, hyper-connected environment that can be quite physical in some of the games, depending on the genre or the game. And we're talking a bigger umbrella of different esports than the Summer Olympics in terms of just how many they are, the variety of them, the different competitions as well. So that's important to keep in mind. But we looked at all these different psychological and physiological outcomes, such as the physical related, nutrition, diet related, sleep related, and physical lifestyle, you know, when they're actually seeing physios and things for their wrists, necks, backs, eyes, or optometrists for the eyes. So that was an interesting finding. There were 3,694 studies in the sample, of which we came down to 36, which with the inclusion criteria related to competitive online gaming. So that is just about to be published, actually. So that was, I think, a much needed study in this newly evolved esports environment I've really emphasized today. Then I did explain, so the so what here, and I think you would all be very concerned with this space. Well, what on earth is happening out there around regulation and governance of this burgeoning landscape called esports and competitive online gaming? And as I've mentioned, at the moment, there's currently, it's a self-regulated industry. The main reason being is that publishers, as I've mentioned, own the industry. They own all the intellectual property. Unlike traditional sports, where it's kind of a shared property with a social sort of mandate, a lot of government funding, a federated model where the governance really forms around it. In esports, there's none of that. Publishers own everything. They own the competitions usually. They're fully vertically integrated. They own the content, being the games. They own a lot of the teams as well. So, but that being said, many of them are engaging in really socially responsible governance, self-governance. But the problem with that is it's inconsistently applied, as I've mentioned. So we're dealing with a lot of complexity here in that it's a global, digitally connected landscape. So very hard to get that universal governance and regulation in place. In some jurisdictions, I know in China, Canada, Korea, governments have regulated around some of these issues. One issue they've regulated around is gambling and preventing minors, for instance, or restricting the amount that of bets that can be placed on esports tournaments in some tournaments. Also restricting microtransactions in-game. Some have been banned altogether. Others have just been restricted as to the amount of money that can be paid to unlock some of these skins or loot boxes, they're called in-game, as a reward system. So you can pay this to have the chance of winning an extra sword or gun or some sort of benefit in-game. So it's a chance you take that can then benefit you and your team. So definitely modeled around gambling. And it's costing, some kids are running up parents' credit cards to access some of these benefits. So it's a big issue. We've recently published a paper on it. So that's a problem as well. The self-regulatory environment also obviously doesn't exist across games, across tournaments, and across jurisdictions. So you're not getting that consistent sanctioning. And when that happens, we get players who might be doing the wrong thing. And that could be this e-doping I've talked about. Actual doping is occurring as well. The use of amphetamines, speed and no-dos, for instance, caffeine, a lot of caffeine as well, so that they can play longer and later, given the duration of these games and tournaments. So that's a real worry. That is not really regulated other than through some codes in some of the competitions. But again, it's only the participants. So some of the people doing the wrong thing can simply transfer around the system to a different tournament, a different team, a different game. Another thing we're seeing is this sort of conflicts of interest, I suppose, where you might have multi-team ownership occurring, where one entity owns all the teams. So then they can house them all together in what's called team housing, where they can train together, practice together. And that can be problematic among a lot of safeguarding issues, for instance, but also in terms of just labour and protection of their rights, and many of which are young people or minors who aren't equally placed to negotiate fair rights under those contracts around hours of training, for instance. So again, coming back to some wellbeing serious risks. I've talked about there with these hurdles around implementing governance, whether it's in a self-regulatory way or external governance, or through a hybrid of these. Due to this publisher market power, it's a big problem. The unique nature of the industry is also a problem as well, in that there's a culture in the industry and among young people in general to not trust authority. So there's this anti-authoritarian culture underpinning it as well. So that we're, dealing with that is a problem too. And I think the one takeaway there is that any regulation and governance needs to be through consensus, through careful consultation and empowerment of key groups and stakeholders across the ecosystem to ensure they're buying in to the need to ensure that the industry grows in a positive way. And minors, of course, is the big risk as well. So we're dealing with that, and a lack of education among people supervising them or employing them or networked to them. So I think the highly networked nature can be a risk in itself. And I've talked about the danger of the digital landscape, and it's, enabling really of cheating and organised crime coming in, to include match fixing and things like that. So look, that's in a nutshell. I've thrown up a few of our papers there that are recently published on this, but I'm really happy to take any Q&A and have a bit of a chat now. I can see there's a few questions on the chat actually, which I'll open up as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Sarah. I think
no worries.
Just some incredible pieces of research there across a number of the issues with what's been an area that I suppose has had a few decades to grow and develop, maybe without the scrutiny that other areas have. And so we do have this landscape of a bit of a lack of understanding in some areas, and now we're grappling with, well, what does this mean to have such an unregulated space going on? So we do have some questions, if it's all right.
Sure.
Might start here. So there's a question in the chat around, from your research, is it possible to see if the teenager or young adult group has a predominant background diagnoses such as ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, that might play into what I assume is sort of a focus on heavier gaming or addicted gaming?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. And that is definitely something for future research. I haven't seen any research done where we're looking at at the moment, the research is looking at sort of general young populations. That was not captured in our research, and I haven't seen it captured yet. I do think it's highly relevant because I do understand, anecdotally at least, there is an adverse selection of kids who might be on the autism spectrum, for instance, who are very talented at esports and really enjoy it. So I think that's a bit of an opportunity for future research to get a lot more granular in the nature of these segments within the population to see how it affects them. I did do a recent study in far north Queensland in the Atherton region, because that region has particularly at-risk youth, particularly high proportion of Indigenous kids as well. But what we found in that one was they actually got a lot of enjoyment and social connectivity from esports. They did report that they were all connected to online gaming, enjoyed it a lot during COVID. This was done the end of last year. So, but there was some connection with heavy gaming again, and some wellbeing issues that we found in these other surveys. So they sort of were pretty similar in profiling from that survey, which is not yet published. So I think it's a great question though, and a really important direction for future research.
Yeah, and I suppose just from when you were going through that, sort of looking at the cohorts of recreational versus heavier gaming, I think the heavier gaming one was looking at when someone is engaging in gaming 3 or 4 times a week, but was there a specific time period over which they might tip from, you know, an hour a night versus what sort of metrics are we looking at?
I've given you a definite snapshot you'll see in the actual published papers, a lot more detail there, but we didn't only capture frequency, but also the duration of the time through which they were gaming. Yeah, so often in the heavier gaming cohorts, you're seeing people engage for sort of 4 to 6 hours daily. I think a lot of them were reporting they were doing it, you know, late in the evening. So they're missing out on sleep as a result of that. We know that. Long extended periods over the weekend. So the question is, well, there's a trade-off there between physical activity, social connection in person. So the study would be another one. So there's lots of questions there around the heavier gaming, but we did capture all of that.
Fabulous. No, looking forward to diving into that one. Another question from the chat that sort of comes out of that discussion around what it means to be part of a community. Are you aware of any of the literature on negative discourses that seem quite endemic in some parts of the online gaming community, particularly around what we might have seen recently, anti-feminist, alt-right, some of the more I guess pseudo-radicalization that we might see. The comment here is that this person has seen it in parts of the gaming community that they frequent, but also see now maybe more people pushing back against it. So any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, another really good point. I think the digital nature of gaming, of course, you get the keyboard warriors like we're seeing on social media as well. And in gaming, it's even worse, I would say, the risk, because they all have handles that are sort of avatars or pseudonyms. You know, they don't regularly use their own name, so they're very hard to identify. Some of the girls do that, I've heard, because they don't want to be identified as females, which in itself says a lot about the culture being problematic. They want to be treated as equals, so they'll go under a pseudonym that's not it's gender neutral. So it's tricky in some ways to pick up, but yeah, look, it's a huge risk. We did find that heavier gamers are, as you'd expect, more subject to bullying. Most had seen it happen. I think it's a problem, but the shiny light in the tunnel is that it is being self-regulated a lot more. I think players and the influencers I mentioned are taking a lot more. They're seeing that, they're stepping up, as we're seeing athletes in the traditional sports space stepping up as well and being quite active around calling out this sort of behavior as being unacceptable. So I think I derive a lot of hope, I think, and positivity from the influencers we're seeing in the gaming space doing great things on that front. So I think that's changing.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point around having those role models in place who already have they've got the community validation and buy-in, so people are going to want to listen to what they have to say. So that's a really excellent point. I have a lot of questions, so I apologize, but
no, we've got time. Yeah, this is great.
Fantastic. So one of the questions was, is there some sort of regulator or governing body for esports, for e-doping or organised crime infiltration? Obviously, there isn't one. You did touch on how this would be an extremely complex process. Has anyone ever tried?
Yeah, look, and I probably should have mentioned that. Another good point. Yeah, there's probably about 4 or 5 organizations that have been set up globally to try and be that overarching, governance body for esports. And a couple are doing very, very well. So there's an esports coalition of integrity. There's the World Esports Association. There's a few like that, and some of them have already been tested and been very good there. The Esports Integrity Coalition, I think, or Commission, I think they're called, have been fantastic. They're actually they're emerging as being quite a good model, I think, where they are independent of the esports sector, which I think is important for any good governance practices. But they have this sort of, an arbitration kind of arm, a code of practice. They're regulating around doping, quite a few signatories to it in terms of the publishers, which I think is very important to have them on board, as I mentioned. Yes, I think there is hope that some of these organisations will do a great job. I do know they are also investing a lot in things like research and engagement strategies, which I think is a very important part of that governance process. Some of the others are really good as well on that front, but some lack, weight in terms of the number of signatories coming in. Some only deal with signatories that are at a national level. So it relates only to national world championships, not to all these other tournaments. So that's a bit of a problem.
All right. Well, fantastic to hear that some people are starting that work, and it'll be interesting to see how it develops.
Yeah.
Bit of an interesting one here. Mentioning LARPing, so live action role play for those who aren't necessarily aware, where in apparently Denmark, LARPing and esports was an elective as part of the main curriculum offered there. Any awareness of whether there are any Australian schools offering a similar buy-in in that way?
Yeah, look, I think it's fantastic to see that, number one, and I have seen a number of examples around the world. I do know here in Australia there's numerous examples, usually being individually teacher-led. If the teacher has an interest in this and they see the power of it, they're introducing it into their own curriculum. We're not seeing it as part of the Australian curricula really at state level, as we probably should maybe down the track, but certainly some pilots that are doing very well. So Somerset College, I think it was on the Gold Coast, I saw recently, have a tremendous program that is interdisciplinary. So they use esports as a platform to teach entrepreneurship, maths, the technology, IT, creative design and industrial design being another, marketing and communications, business sort of concept. So I think it is a really powerful platform to better engage kids in education. There's been some fantastic examples as well, not just in Europe, and Denmark being one example, but the UK as well. In America, we're seeing it. We're seeing it at tertiary level in some universities, which are very strong brands in the market, are introducing esports degrees, as well as an esports program that's part of the athletic scholarship system, for instance, in the US. So I think it could be a really powerful platform to engage kids better in education, I would say.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And it's really interesting hearing that, some of the bigger tertiary education providers are getting behind that concept of, well, if we're gamifying education, what does it really look like? So fantastic. All right, another one. Given that those hardline approaches don't seem to work and can actually create some harm and distance in relationships, how can community service organisations support their clients who may be parents or carers in understanding the realities and the risks and the opportunities presented by esports?
Yeah, like it's the big question, isn't it? When you're dealing with an environment that's evolving very quickly and doesn't have adequate governance and regulation yet. What can you do at the grassroots level when you're dealing with kids who might be addicted to gaming, parents who don't fully understand how to mitigate these issues? So I guess the main one would be to encourage parents to talk with their kids about esports, learn more about esports, go and watch it yourself, play the game with them, understand the kind of structure in it. Don't just sort of buy the game for them, let them go and play it or let them download it, ask them about it. Say, well, what happens in Fortnite? Who are the characters? What are you trying to, what are the objectives here? Do you mind if I watch you? You know, it's that sort of really talking to your kid about the hobby, the activity in detail, learning about that game. So, and then you might say, look, you know, and having a conversation to establish some norms. So just saying, look, you know, at some point you've got to do some study, you know, you have to, or at some point I want you to, you know, go out and let's practice your soccer or your, whatever your sport they might be doing, or seeing your friends, let's get some friends over and not do gaming when your friends are over, but sitting down to establish some norms that might help when things might escalate down the track. So if you can get agreement that, you know, when it comes to dinner time, I want you to come and sit at the table and eat your dinner. We need to know when a good time to interrupt your gaming might be if you're gaming at that time, you know, and that's sort of understanding the structure of the game. So I know in something like Fortnite, it's a highly addictive game in its structure, but there's certain areas in it when there's a clear break between sections. And, you know, so I think, you know, understanding when that might be and agreeing in that break, that is when we will stop the gaming and you will come and you will do that other activity. So that sort of stuff. It's hard though, it's hard. But I think one thing not to do, as I mentioned earlier, is to do something that's sudden, without warning, without prior discussion, wasn't part of that norm setting or contract even, and grabbing the machine physically or console and taking it away, or cutting the internet, the Wi-Fi in the house as you can these days. That seems to escalate and has resulted in domestic violence occurring. So probably not the best way there. I think a lot of it's just educating themselves around the gaming and even some of the influences as well, and making sure that some of the more positive influences in the gaming space you know, are aligned and in their kids' world might be helpful.
I think that sort of makes a lot of sense. It sounds like a lot of areas of parenting and working with children and young people, it really is stay curious and don't turn it into a power battle.
Good summary. I like that. I'm going to take that, steal that. But that's exactly right. Yeah.
No, I think that's a really great breakdown of it, and just some practical. You can't enforce rules over something you don't know or understand. So you've got to put it on yourself to know and understand it. That's great.
It's sort of like, I guess, music. You know, I've got 4 teenagers myself, young adults, and the music in the car scenario, it's like, you know, you might hate the music that they want to play, but you should listen to it. Yeah,
because they are exactly. That's such a good point. Okay, has there been any, and I think you actually touched on this in the presentation a little bit, has there been any research around sleep disorders and esports?
Yeah, so we did look at sleep deprivation as one of the measures of well-being that we looked at in the second survey. And yeah, we did find again the association with heavy gaming. There was significant sleep deprivation risk. And we did find, I think there was some difference between age cohorts as well. So I think the sleeping risk was even worse for, I think it was the 18 to 25-year-olds. But still, it was heavier gamers were most at risk for that variable as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I guess especially when the cohort is 16 to 34, it does sort of mean that if people are outside of that school cohort, then they probably have jobs, they probably have other responsibilities. So when they get to game is very late at night, and that's their time. So no, that's Just based on the one that we had before, this question links in quite well. Has the research that looked at effective parenting for healthy levels of gaming led to any useful guides for youth workers, counsellors, family support workers and teachers? Any that you'd suggest people might want to touch on?
Yeah, look, there's not a lot out there. I do know, though, there's a couple of psychologists who deal a lot with youth who are very concerned in this space, who are rolling out workshops. And one wrote a book, actually. I can send that through. Marshall, is it Brad Marshall? I think his name is. If anyone's heard of him, he's excellent and he has written a book on it. So I think that would be a great reference because it's really digestible, really, but great one for parents to have a look at.
Yes, no, we'll send that out.
Details through, yeah.
Thank you. Still got a fair few people are really finding this an interesting one, Sarah. Are there any precedents for the AOD sector, so the alcohol and other drug sector, to provide treatment for young people with heavy gaming? So the one of the things noted here is that at one organisation, they've offered residential withdrawal and dual diagnosis clinical support to young people with gaming issues, but this doesn't really fit comfortably within the service system and tends to only happen when there's co-occurring substance use and abuse.
Yeah, I think you guys have your hands full as it is. That would be my first comment. It's a whole other addiction. The trouble is in the research, I think, that does need to be done, and that you'll see, of course, is often they're coexisting, and you don't know whether one causes the other or whether so there's all of that. The World Health Organization's listed gaming as a separate addiction. So that in itself says it needs its own treatment, I imagine. But yeah, look, there's probably scope. I think you guys are probably going to see a lot of that anyway. I don't know if you are seeing a lot of that, but yeah, I think research is needed on that. But there's gaming addiction clinics I know springing up all over the world right now for young kids too, which is kind of sad.
Yeah, especially as I guess the research is developing. So what the best model is or what best practice looks like is still potentially questionable, especially if there's not a co-occurring substance use.
That's right. Yeah, there's just so many different dynamics there. But at the end of the day, I think a lot, it's, I think the biggest epidemic, and you guys might agree, I don't know, seems to be loneliness in our society. And so a lot of the time, yeah, these kids are turning to, I guess, substance abuse and gaming and other, as a means to connect. So it's, yeah, that's part of it, but it is quite complex.
Absolutely.
I'd be interested to hear actually if people are coming across it a fair bit, what they think might be gaming addiction.
Yeah, and then I guess how they go about identifying it. Absolutely. So if anyone wants to pop in the chat, if you've experienced that from an organizational perspective in your work, please pop it in. That'd be fantastic. Got an observation, not a question, just an observation around social connectivity. This questioner has had a number of clients in recent years for whom gaming provides an avenue to maintain contact they find meaningful with peers whom they are otherwise trying to avoid due to those peers continuing to actively use substances that the client is trying to avoid, and how helpful they can find this for their own recovery. And I suppose fitting into your point around loneliness, Sarah, like a lot of addictions, one of the biggest part, if you come out of it, would be the loss of the community that you had during that addiction. Do you think that the dynamics around, gaming addiction, which still doesn't necessarily, people aren't going to view yet, potentially gaming addiction the same way as drug addiction, do you think that creates some barriers for getting help and support or even maintaining community?
So the question is about gaming addiction,
the observation was around having some clients who had substance addiction, but so they game now to maintain connection with communities that they can't really see face to face and physically, otherwise putting themselves back at risk of returning to addiction. And so that's the observation. I guess the question is more, do you think that the lack of understanding around gaming addiction and do you think people still don't necessarily take it seriously enough?
I think people are taking it seriously, because I think we're just seeing, if you talk to psychologists, parents, teachers, and as I said, we need to tease apart a lot more gaming and social media and the dopamine mechanisms linked to that, as well as the gaming. So it's not all bad, but certainly screen time in general, interventions are absolutely needed.
Yeah, definitely. Got one on loot boxes. So if loot boxes are regulated, will this impact the Interactive Gambling Act of 2001? Will it open the floodgates to online casinos?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's so much debate in the literature right now as to the definition of loot box and microtransactions in game, whether they actually fall within existing anti-gambling legislation around the world. So a lot of it in India, for instance, where it's illegal, if it's a game of chance, it's okay. I think there's all these different tests and all the rest. But yeah, look, that is a good question. I know they're looking at it right now. It's not fully settled. I think a lot of authorities aren't really across the different types, almost the typology of different microtransactions in the games as well. So I think that needs doing as well, to truly understand which ones might fall within it and which ones may not. But yeah, look, it could, if it truly is gambling and not just a game of chance, I would say.
I guess what an important point about making sure that lawmakers and policymakers are thoroughly across the nuances of these different microtransactions and how they present in games is really critical.
That's right.
And I suppose porting off of that one, given that there's a 15% gambling advertising product placement, does the research say anything about the correlation between gaming and esports and online gambling?
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, I haven't really found anything. So I think what they're asking is, if you're a heavy gamer in esports, are you likely to also be a heavy gambler? No, our study actually focused, in terms of the survey study following that content analysis, we focused on alcohol, exposure to alcohol brands, because the Foundation of Alcohol Research and Education funded it. But yeah, look, I think that would be a really interesting study to do. I'd love to. In fact, we might do that next.
Absolutely. Just write that one down. That's a good one. I can't hear you, Sarah. I'm not sure if other people are able to. The sound just seems to have dropped out quickly. Is that just for me, or are other people able to hear Sarah?
I can't hear Sarah either.
Okay. Something seems to have happened to make the sound drop out. So just give us a moment, everyone, while we try.
Can you hear me again? Hello?
Yes.
I don't know what happened. It just went to mute automatically. I didn't touch anything.
I'm glad we have you back. Not sure what happened, but relieved it wasn't just my internet giving me a heads up that it was about to cut out. So
yeah.
Okay, so another interesting one here on professional gamers. A professional gamer is a popular career path amongst young people at the moment. Often they're financially motivated, similar to when young people are interested in becoming influencers. They're looking at revenue streams like online streaming, esports, sponsorships, endorsements. There are a lot of avenues available. What are your thoughts on streaming, and how do parents know what healthy amounts of gaming are when someone is looking at training or upskilling if they're aspiring to be a professional gamer? That's a really
these are great questions, by the way. I really like it. Yeah, look, it's an interesting one, because it actually is quite a viable and realistic career path now. So whether you become a professional gamer or you work in this burgeoning industry, there's going to be a lot of jobs. So I think that's one point, that don't maybe crush the dream, just like you may not crush, the dream of the professional wallaby or AFLW player out in the backyard. Let them go. But I think at the end of the day, going back to our data, depending on their age and all the rest, you've got to make sure they're leading a balanced life. And any high performance manager, coach in traditional sports would say the same thing. These Olympians we're currently seeing winning gold medals, yes, they're extremely focused at what they do. They're extremely good at what they do. They put in hours of training, but they also, many of them study, and that's been mentioned a lot in the media, I've noticed, which is great. They also, many of them have families, and they're saying hello to their families and friends to thank them as their first message. So and many of them are running side businesses as well. So I think their message is to take away and plant into esports, just like any professional sport. Make sure if you're not leading a balanced lifestyle, you won't do well in that sport either. So I think that's a really important thing. But yeah, I think letting them train, I think part of the training too, we know when you talk to professional esports players and team owners, they expect, physical training as well. Because to think really, you need like a fast twitch reaction times, for instance, to perform well. You need cognitive spatial ability. You need to think really clearly, communicate clearly. So really you need to exercise physically to be in peak form as well when the time comes for the competitive competition. So I think really emphasizing to your kids, this is a great dream to have, go for it, but lead a balanced lifestyle and do your physical training as well as the gaming actual training, because, here's a whole lot of professional esporters who do that. They are expected to do the physical training as well.
What a great response, and such an important one, especially with the Olympics going on at the moment, to say, committing to any professional career does require commitment, it requires focus, and it requires a holistic approach so that you can handle it. That's fantastic. Thank you. So people often associate gaming with the younger cohort, so teenagers and maybe early 20s, but that main cohort of 16 to 34 suggests that people who are in that heavier gaming category could also be parents and carers who are engaging in that activity themselves. Are the suggested interventions different for older gaming cohorts?
Yeah, another really good question. This kind of addiction, it's not just it's not just the minors, but obviously I've talked a lot about them because of the protectionist kind of policy needed for them being a uniquely vulnerable population. But yeah, look, if you've got parents also addicted, which could be the case, parents really have to think about their role modeling, I suppose. But definitely, looking for the necessary support outside, through psychologists, physios are often needed, optometrists as well, GPs, to look for the signs that, they may be, or even aggressive behavior when, like withdrawal symptoms. It's that sort of behavior with gaming addiction as well, that, they get very, all those signs that everyone here would be aware of when they're away from the substance that they are addicted to. So I think it's just maybe some self-help, but understanding that if they have kids in the household as well, their relationships can be affected. So I think that's hard. Some parents in our study, I know, actually play regularly with their kids. And they were saying it was a wonderful activity because it was a bonding activity. It was a family activity together that they both enjoyed very much. So I think in moderation, again, that's okay. But if it's isolating that parent from their family life and their other facets of life, then that's not a good thing.
And that's a really great point, especially around that pro-social gaming role modeling and being able to say, this is something, we play PUBG together, or we play this together and we see success together and we enjoy it, but it's part of a broader family life that goes on. Thank you. Well, look, I think we've got one last question, and it looks like a really perfect one to end on. From a harm reduction point of view, what sort of public health policy would you be hoping that our government would establish in regards to online gaming and esports?
There's so many. I think, well, we have seen it starting, with the digital platforms inquiry recently, looking to govern more, develop appropriate policies in the advertising and marketing space, I suppose, in those digital realms that include esports and gaming. I'd like to see a lot more of that, because we know that exposure leads to preference, leads to behavior and consumption. and particularly when you're dealing with harmful products. So just like we have the regulations around alcohol advertising, for instance, I think there needs to be probably more of that. In terms of the actual codifying within the games and tournaments and things, I think working very closely with the eSports Integrity Coalition, some of these, and there's a national one here in Australia as well, I'm working closely with them to understand what is happening in the industry, making sure they engage, like I said, have a very consultative process, which most policy does, I understand that. But in this particular sector, more than ever, you need some youth advisors, for instance. You need the publishers need to be right at the table, because, as I said, they're a monopoly in this industry. They own everything, and they're keen for it to grow positively as well. But you've got to have them on side as well. Perhaps some of the influencers, parents involved as well. And I think having a really good advisory committee set up for the government would be really useful.
I think that's a great point. It is always really important to say that the answers aren't going to come from just the one source. It's got to be from that the entire community that's being impacted or uses
absolutely
platforms.
And I'd probably say too, and I'm trying not to be biased, but I think funding more research in this space would be great, and research that directly relates to informing policy in this area.
Absolutely, and I think that just from what we've gotten to see here today, the impact of that research in terms of our understandings and what we can then go on to communicate to clients and community service organisations and also bring into our own lives is really critical. Well, look, I think we've covered all of the many questions that we had for you, Sarah. I'm so glad that we had that additional time built in to be able to go through that.
Great discussion. I've filed away. Thank you so much, everyone. You've helped inform the next lot of research. It's very interesting, and well done to the great work everyone does here.
Yeah, and look, a final very obvious question: do you play?
No, not really. I mean, I don't mind a bit of, maybe the AFL one, but I get a giggle out of that because the players actually look like some of the players. It's quite funny.
That's cool.
But not overly, no. But I understand why kids would enjoy it, and you can see some fantastic skill building, as I said, in rapid decision making under ambiguity and pressure, for instance, that we all know we need. So I think it's good in moderation.
Absolutely. All right. Well, look, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us and for providing that incredible presentation. I think it's been a really wonderful opportunity for people to hear about an area that we don't necessarily see coming up in a really thorough, well-reasoned and researched way. I know from the chat already, many people have said thank you so much for that. And thank you everyone for joining us here today. A follow-up webinar on technology and addiction part 2 is going to explore a little bit of that neuroscience that Sarah touched on behind tech dependence and gaming disorder, including looking at diagnoses and effective interventions as well. But for now, Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your time with us. We've appreciated it immensely.
Great. Look, thanks so much, Danny, and everyone. And look, I think that follow-up seminar will be really useful and may help to answer some of the questions that you have asked today that probably are a little bit outside the expertise of the studies I've run. I do know I'm working with a couple of psychologists at the moment on a study on addiction, so I'm sure you'll find that useful, that next seminar.
Brilliant. And I'm sure we'll all very much want to see that research as well. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today for another TriPeaks webinar. Again, the recording and the slides will be made available. We'll look forward to sending out dates for future webinars. But in the meantime, please stay safe and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.